One of the concerns, in fact, one of the fears that people have about placing children in kinship care is whether or not the caregiver is going to be able to place the needs of the children over, guess who?
Their own needs.
Their own needs, and who else? Birth parents. Exactly, the birth parents. Now, let's talk about why that becomes an issue. All right, go back to your courses on attachment and bonding. Here's my question to you. A foster parent or adoptive parent's initial attachment and bonding is with whom first? And I'm talking about an adoptive parent or the foster parent that's not related to the birth parent. Oh, I didn't even have to finish the question. Y'all must have aced those bonding and attachment courses. Yeah, exactly. It's going to be to the child, and it's a no-brainer. The needs of the children take precedent to those of adults and the birth parent. For a relative caregiver, initial attachment and bonding is with whom first? See, yeah, all right, yeah, you aced those courses, okay? Because you're right, it's going to be to the birth parent. Now, they know intellectually that the needs of the children should take precedent to the birth parent. So they know that, but emotionally, it becomes more difficult when that birth parent is their what? Child. In fact, they are frequently reminded, their vulnerability is being reminded by who? The birth parent, that the birth parent is what? Their child. Sounds like this. How can you say I can't come over and visit? How can you say I can't live there any longer? I'm your child. That's the vulnerability. How can you say that you're going to put this grandchild, my child, before me? You knew me what? First and longer. How can you say that you believe that social worker over me? I'm your right, son, daughter, sister, brother. And it could be aunt or uncle, okay, saying sister, brother. So it's all the relatives. It's anyone in that relative. Or remember I talked about the non-biological kin? Yeah, I'm your friend. We grew up as friends and families. How can you? But the vulnerability is that they have and will trigger for that relative caregiver the thought that I'm your son, daughter, sister, brother, friend, because we had a pre-what? Pre-existing relationship. That's a vulnerability that relative caregivers and kinship caregivers have that foster and adoptive parents that are non-relatives don't have. Can you see them coming up to a foster parent's home and knocking on their door saying, listen, I need to have a place to stay tonight. Do you think you could let me in? Can you, yeah, you're smiling like the foster parent would say, what? Right. They don't have that access. They don't have that right. They don't have that entitlement. They feel they have that entitlement with a relative caregiver, with kin. They feel they have that entitlement. They feel they have that right. That pre-existing relationship makes them feel that they have that entitlement. I grew up in that house, so I'm just coming back to the house that I grew up in. Just let me stay in my room. I'm not going to get in the way, So it's that pre-existing relationship, those entitlements, those rights that make kinship caregivers vulnerable. So here are your cues. Well, this is what we're going to do. What are those cues that you need to be looking out for, listening? What are the red flags that are letting you know that guilt is there? How do we approach it to help caregivers manage those feelings? And then talk a little bit about the differences and what implications it has for your practice, okay? So when we know that there's that vulnerability, here are the things you want to listen for in your conversation and in your assessments. Is what's happening to my son, daughter, or brother, who is the birth parent, my fault? Foster parents and adoptive parents don't ask those kind of questions. They don't make those kind of statements. They may feel empathy, but they don't feel it's their fault. Relative caregivers may ask these questions. And if you don't hear these comments, do some assessments. Do you feel it's your fault? Ask that question. You wouldn't ask that question of a foster parent or an adoptive parent that's not related. In kinship care, you need to ask that question. That's why it's kind of become a little bit different, because it's a different skill set, different kinds of assessments that you need to conduct. So when you're going out, you're developing that plan, you're developing profiles, you're getting a feel for that family. When you hear the word kin, you need to put that question in there. You need to find out right off the top of the bat. Do you feel like this is your fault? I can't blame my daughter for not wanting her child to live with me. And here's the part that goes with that. Look at what I did to who? Them. Okay? That's the other part that goes with that. Again, foster adoptive families, you're not asking that. Kinship, you need to ask that kind of question and do that kind of assessment. Is taking this child going to come between me and my son or my daughter or my sister? You know, are they more preoccupied with that relationship than the needs of the child? You know, and it makes sense because that was their primary relationship. That's the first relationship. Because the response, when I first heard that, I would say, why should you care? I shouldn't tell you I was so insensitive, you know, but I didn't know. I was thinking they were like foster parents. And my response was, why should you care? What difference does that make? In kinship care, it makes a difference because that's my son, my daughter. I want to preserve that pre-existing relationship. I don't want anything to come in between that. So yeah, that's why they should care. Did my mistake as a parent cause my child to turn out the way they did? That's the one. That's like the bullet. The silver bullet for relative caregivers is what I did, the way I raised them, caused them to be that way. And he blames me for taking his child and believes that I always wanted to take the child from him. You never thought I was good enough to keep that child. You always thought I was a problem. I could never do anything to make you happy. Hear the vulnerability? That's kind of like what goes along with that dialogue. Your assessment question is, how does the birth parent feel about you taking the child? And how does that affect you? Okay? So I know I've thrown a lot at you, but I see you nodding. It just kind of fits right in though, doesn't it? You know, once you know about pre-existing and what those dynamics are, yeah, the cues make sense. When we first heard these statements, we didn't even know what we were hearing. You know, we ignored it. I mean, just imagine me saying, so what if it hurts your relationship? Big deal. I expect you to know that the needs of the kids come before adults. But when you think about bonding and attachment, it is a big deal, and it can make a difference. So, what are your goals? You got to help that relative caregiver live with the guilt. When I say guilt, I'm talking about the regrets, and we all have them. They've got to live with it. They've got to forgive themselves. They can't wait for the birth parents to forgive them. They have to forgive themselves. And they're going to have to, and this is the most important part, they've got to know what those triggers are. They've got to know what the triggers are. Is the trigger going to be you got pregnant too soon? You should have left your spouse when there was domestic violence going on? Is the trigger going to be their substance abuse history or their history of incarceration or divorce, whatever? What's going to trigger that's going to make them vulnerable to being manipulated, vulnerable to being mistreated, vulnerable to not setting limits? You see, because guilt makes you, I'll ask you this question. When you feel guilty, you feel as though you deserve to be what? Punished. You feel like you need to make up. For a caregiver, they feel like they deserve to be punished, and they feel as though they have to make up for what happened, which makes you vulnerable to bending the rules, like visitation, like court orders, like contacts, bending the rules around supervising contacts. All of a sudden, you feel like you owe, so you feel like you have to make up for. You feel responsible, so that makes you vulnerable to bending those rules. And when you bend those rules, you're also then making who else vulnerable to being abused and neglected and manipulated? The child. So that's why you've got to deal with that guilt so that they don't become vulnerable to being manipulated, which then puts the child at risk. That's how the guilt all ties into. So, here are your conversations. Here's your scripts. If you hear relative caregivers saying things like, it's my fault, I'm causing them the problems that they now have, you might say, and this may sound a little callous, okay, you may be partially responsible. You may be partially responsible for that birth parent coming up having the problems that they're having. Yeah, maybe your drugs or your alcohol or your abuse or being too young. Yeah, you may be partially responsible for it, but you've admitted your mistake. You're not trying to make excuses for it. You've done what you can do to remediate those mistakes, and you've learned from those mistakes so you can do things differently now. So you've earned the right to move on. And that's what living with the guilt means, living with the regrets. So when you can say to them, hey, are there any more excuses that you can make? And the answer is no. Are there any more explanations that you could give that are going to change the situation? If the answer is no, is there any more reparations that you can do to make up for what you did? And the answer is no. Then they need to know that it's time to move on. And are you doing things differently now that you did then? Yes, they've earned the right to move on. Okay, because that's the first step. Then they need to validate their growth. The trigger for them might be hearing someone say, you're not any different now than you were then. You may have those agency folks fooled, but I remember, you're not the same person that you're putting this front on to be. So that caregiver is going to have to validate themselves because they're now questioning their competence. That's what's being questioned, their competence and their ability to be a kinship caregiver. If you're picking that up, you may need to say to them, but yeah, okay, those things did happen. You were that kind of person. But look, you're not the same person now that you were then. They'll need to hear you say that. And then you give them the facts and the evidence to prove it. You're taking care of these children. You're not doing drugs and alcohol anymore. You're in recovery. You're self-sufficient. You're independent. You're being the parent that they said that you couldn't be. So it's giving them the evidence and giving them the facts that prove that they are not the same person so that they were now, to validate their competency to be a caregiver. And by the way, those triggers can come from themselves as well as from the birth parent because they can begin thinking about that themselves and making themselves vulnerable. When you hear caregivers saying things like, I'll never be able to live down what I did, there's never enough that I could do to make them forgive me. It doesn't seem like no matter what I do, it's going to be enough for them to stop being angry with me. At that point, you're hearing those kind of statements, your job is to get them to forgive themselves. In the conversations in the scripts, you are a better parent now. You have the right to forgive yourself because you are a better parent now. You have a right to forgive yourself because you are taking care of their children. You have a right to forgive yourself because you're now giving them a second chance to get themselves together. It's validating their competency and then showing why and how they deserve to forgive themselves. Another trigger has to do with all of a sudden that child is starting to call them what? Mom. And all of a sudden, they're the ones going to those IEP meetings. And all of a sudden, they're the ones that child is attaching to. So they've got to learn how to accept those roles. And you start hearing things like, oh, I don't really want to take my daughter's place. I don't really want to take my son's place. They get so angry when the kids call me mom. They've got to learn to live with that guilt. So what you might want to engage them is what I call, if not you, then who conversations. If you don't help them get ready for school, if not you, then who? And if you don't teach them how to crawl so that they can then walk, if not you, then who? And if you don't teach them the ABCs now, if not you, then who? You want the birth parents to be at that IEP meeting, but if they can't be, if not you, then you. Can you hear the conversations? Yeah. It's kind of like getting them to acknowledge, yeah, I know you don't want to, but if not you, then who? I think what's important here is that as we go through these dialogues, they're really not just for you to use these scripts. The ultimate goal is for relative caregivers to have these dialogues with guess who? Themselves. We talk about empowerment. That's what empowerment is all about. Being able to have these conversations with yourself when those triggers get pushed. So here's your work. Got to help them know what those triggers are. Well, what's going to make you? So in your conversation, it's kind of like, well, it sounds like you have some regrets. You know, what are the things that you're having regrets about? They're called triggers. What are the buttons that can get pushed to make them bend the rules? You know, what are the buttons that can get pushed that are going to make them regrets? And the buttons can get pushed by themselves or by the birth parent. So, you know, what are you upset about? You know, what are the things that make you feel regret? You know, what do you need to do to make up for that? Caregivers have to know what the triggers are. And by the way, this is safety planning for kinship caregivers. You know how we talk about safety planning for kids all the time? Safety planning starts with kinship caregivers. They need to know how to protect themselves from being abused, misused, mistreated, so that they can protect who else? The child. So the two kind of go in hand. This is prevention planning for them. More specifically, what's going to happen if they show up and need a place to stay? What happens if they come here and say they need money? What happens if they've been evicted and they need a place to stay overnight? What are you going to do if they come in their home high? That's prevention planning, safety planning that you may have to engage kinship caregivers in. Okay, so safety planning for children begins with safety planning with who first? Caregivers. Okay, thank you.